Did you know that only 29% of philosophers accept or lean towards gender being biological? You know, the claim that
a woman by definition is an adult human female. A man is an adult human male.
Yeah, 29%. Indeed, more than 2 out of 3 philosophers instead accept or lean towards gender being a social construct or psychological, coming in at 63% and 22% respectively. Now, if you ask me, this poses quite the intriguing question. Why is it that most of those who study epistemology, language, metaphysics, ethics, logic, and social and political philosophy do not accept or lean towards the biological case that many, in fact most, laypeople maintain? Well, if you ask some commentators, the answer is obvious. It's really obvious. It's because academic institutions are saturated with woke ideology, whatever that means these days.
Would you mind defining woke? Because it's come up a couple times and I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
So, I mean, woke is sort of the idea that this is going to be one of those moments that goes viral.
Indeed, these philosophers don't know something that you don't, do they? No, there's no chance that throughout their tens of thousands of hours of studying, they've been swayed by considering things that you haven't. Definitely not. They're woke fools. But we don't just label and dismiss here at Rationality Rules. No, we're going to dive into this contentious topic in the attempt to answer why, precisely, philosophers are so woke. Alright, let's get serious. For the purpose of transparency, I think that it might be appropriate to begin this video, and indeed this series, by letting everyone know where I stand. So to be clear, I'm not going to exhaustively defend my views in this video, nor my reasoning. That will come throughout the series. Rather, my aim here is to set the stage, and this includes letting you know where I'm at. The first thing I want to say is that creating content debating the validity of trans people feels fundamentally wrong to me. It's comparable to debating the existence of atheists or homosexuals. Romans 1:20 states God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen. And Christians have, and in many cases still do, employ this verse to accuse atheists of lying about their disbelief. Hence, per this assertion, atheists don't really exist. We're merely suppressing the truth. Similarly, arguments have been made suggesting that homosexuality is unnatural, a mental disease even, rather than recognizing it as a form of love. Hence, per this assertion, homosexuals don't really exist. Rather, homosexuals are corrupted heterosexuals. Now, as far as I'm convinced, we are more than less in the midst of observing the same fight, the same bullshit, in relation to trans people. For the reasons and arguments I'll provide in the coming episodes, I think it's really obvious that, as they say, trans people exist. That is, that their experiences and identities are real and valid. But due to our time in history, I'm having to debate the topic. This is where the current dialectic is, and I've got to meet it where it's at. If I lived a few decades back, I would have engaged similarly on the homosexual debate, and a few decades further back still on the women's rights debate. Outside of violence, cold rational debate is a crucial way that societal issues move forward, and if we wish to avoid violence, and we should, then we need to allow the debate to occur. So there's a brief statement on why I'm addressing this fight in the way that I am. Throughout this series, I will delve into philosophical, biological, and sociological perspectives, and I will do my best to illuminate the complexities of each area of discourse, all while presenting the arguments and counter-arguments with as much fairness and respect as I can. But talking of respect, let's not forget that at the heart of this debate are real people with real lives. As we move forward, I urge everyone to approach this topic with an open mind and compassionate heart. Remember, we're not just debating abstract concepts here, we're discussing people's lives, and that is something that we should never take lightly. At the present, arguments revolving around trans people and their place in society dominate Western dialogue, and yet, if you're a philosopher or a philosophy enthusiast, it's very likely that you find these debates incredibly frustrating. Why? Because it's painfully obvious that those with the loudest voices know nothing of philosophy, and they present a ridiculous all-or-nothing case where you must either be in favour of everything trans or nothing trans. But this isn't true. You can believe in the existence of trans people and yet hold all sorts of views on the various internal debates. Views that can get you thrown under the label anti-trans. Debates like whether trans women should be allowed to use the women's bathroom, whether trans men in prison should be moved to male prisons, whether trans women should be allowed to compete in women's sports, whether pronouns should include they, them, and at what age and under what conditions people should be allowed to transition. These are all complex questions, and answers to one question does not necessarily entail answers to another. I, for instance, am convinced that we should include they, them pronouns, but when it comes to weightlifting, because I separate sex from gender, I don't think gender is relevant. What's relevant, by my lights, are physical attributes that heavily correlate with secondary sex characteristics. Further still, it's also the case, just like in any other debate, that one could affirm a position and yet not endorse the most prominent arguments in favour of that position. To use myself again as an example, I affirm the existence of trans people, but I think that the self-identification argument, an argument that is very popular, is untenable. Indeed, despite what the loudest voices insist, this isn't an all-or-nothing proposition. It isn't a one-dimensional discourse. Alright, with that said, let's ask, Qui Bono? To whom is it a benefit? Who benefits from the all-or-nothing proposition? Sadly, it's extremists, that's who, and especially conservative evangelical Christians, which, to be clear, doesn't mean all Christians, at least not most Christians outside of the United States. For decades, the evangelicals have been losing cultural battles on every front, be it gay rights, the teaching of evolution in schools, the legality of drugs, sex education, religious freedom, and, ironically enough, the status of women in society. But as far as I'm convinced, the evangelicals are gaining ground in the trans debate at the present, and this is because they've successfully encouraged the general population to view all trans-related issues as a single unified proposition, an all-or-nothing scenario. This is why they bring up men in women's prisons when discussing, say, athletics. It's not relevant, but they win. They absolutely win by conflating the broad dialogue. The truth, though, and as already said, is that this isn't an all-or-nothing proposition, and if I succeed in conveying anything throughout my series, I hope to at least impart and reinforce this fact. Those that treat all things trans as a single proposition are not fit to discuss the topic. And yes, of course, this includes some very loud and very obnoxious lefties. Talking of obnoxious politics, here's a tool I've been using to get a better perspective on the perspectives of others. Ground News. One of the cool perks of this app is that you can search by topic. For instance, we can see that there's been 848 recent stories published on the entry of transgender, and we can see on the side a media bias breakdown, and, not surprisingly, the right has published more on this topic than has the left. But hey, you probably already knew that. But it's always good to get confirmation. What you probably didn't know, however, are which stories are being covered disproportionately. You see, in addition to having a breakdown of each topic, Ground News provides insight on blind spots. So we can see that left sources are essentially ignoring the news of surgeons using a medical robot to crank out a higher volume of sex changes, whereas the right are essentially ignoring Russia further restricting transgender rights. In fact, let's find out which rights specifically. Holy crap! They've just passed a bill that bans transitioning procedures, dissolves marriages, and prohibits transgender people from becoming foster or adoptive parents. Surely at least the libertarian right would have something to say about this egregious governmental oppression. No? Anyhow, you get the point. Ground News is an extremely insightful app, and they've teamed up with me to offer you a 30% discount. To get this discount and check out their services, be sure to click my link before August 1st. By signing up through my link, you'll not only become better informed, but you'll also be helping us out at Rationality Rules. And on behalf of the team, thank you. And indeed, thank you to Ground News for sponsoring the channel. Right then, before moving on, let me give you an idea of what this series will consist of. Throughout, we'll be discussing relevant topics with those who know them the best. So when it comes to, say, biology, we'll be chatting with biologists because they're the experts in that field. We'll also be dealing with the bad arguments that are pro-trans as well as the good arguments. The arguments that, I should say, have at least convinced me. The point of this series is to try and cover all angles. If you're tired of the lack of earnest exchange and you really want to understand those that you currently disagree with, then it's my hope that this series will help you in that endeavour. Now, before we do the impossible and define what a woman is, we need to define definitions. And that is what this first episode is all about. Definitions. I know, it sounds off topic, but it ain't. If people want to confidently debate what is and isn't the right usage of a word, and they very much are doing this, then they better first demonstrate at least a rudimentary understanding of how definitions work. And they don't. My thesis statement here is that most debates on this topic fail because of this lack of knowledge, and what follows is my case.
You know, in my view, everybody has a theory of gender. And what I mean by that is that everybody has certain assumptions going about what gender is or should be.
Well, I mean, a woman is whatever J.K. Rowling says a woman is. Right. And she's right. A woman is a biological human female.
A woman is someone who defines as a woman, period, done.
A woman is a female, and the female is defined by the genes she has, essentially.
A woman, by definition, is an adult human female. A man is an adult human male.
For me, a woman is someone who is an adult, who is human, and is female. And female is both a biological category, where we're talking about biological sex, and a gender category. So depending on what we're talking about, if you're saying best female rapper, no one's checking chromosomes. If you're talking about female reproductive health, you know, people aren't just talking about your social life. It can be a biological or a gender category.
So when
the standard categorizations of woman and man relate to sex, and always have, in every natural language.
I'm not going to use preferred pronouns. I'm going to use the pronouns that are accurate.
a woman is an adult female who does not have a penis. I can't even believe I have to say that on air.
I insist that what it is to be a woman, or indeed what it is to be a man or any other gender, is an open-ended question.
All right. So we've just heard some confidently stated definitions pertaining to what it is to be a man or a woman, with the most prominent definition, the one that you'll commonly see in a dictionary no less, being that a woman is an adult human female. In the next episode, I'm going to delve fully into this definition, but before we do this, we need a fundamental understanding of how definitions work. The reason for this, as said earlier, is because when it comes to this debate, the loudest voices know nothing of philosophy, and particularly epistemology, the study of knowledge. And yet, if one is going to argue about what is and isn't the right definition of a word, then they need to 1. Understand how definitions work, and 2. Have a consistent framework. To achieve this, though, let's pivot our focus to a term that's less politically charged and emotionally laden. Let's talk about castles. Now, don't worry, we're not about to embark on a dry academic journey, at least I hope not. We're going to have a bit of fun with this. After all, who doesn't love a good castle? They've been around for millennia, they've featured in countless stories and films, and we've all used the term in conversation at some point. But despite their familiarity, can you provide the definition of a castle? Go on, give it a shot. Define a castle. Alright, I'm just teasing. Defining a castle is actually quite straightforward. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, a castle is a large building or group of buildings fortified against attack with thick walls, battlements, towers, and in many cases, a moat.
Just like Portchester Castle! Look at it! It's even got a moat! Well, kind of. That right there, by the way, is where the monk's poop came down outside of the walls.
And yes, I've just made you look up an ancient toilet plumbing. You're welcome. But hey, we've done it. We've defined a castle, and it really wasn't that hard. Hey, Reese.
Hey, Steve. Got a small problem with your definition. It sucks. You see, it doesn't accurately describe quite a few castles, and perhaps worse, it entails that all forts are castles. But they're not. I mean, sure, Portchester Castle here fits your definition, and so too does this one, which is Bodiam Castle. Glorious place, by the way. But, this one doesn't, and neither does this. Why has history determined that these are castles, when they don't have your thick walls or towers? You need to do better, my friend.
Alright, I hear you. I'll come up with another definition, okay? This time I'm gonna get it right.
12 seconds later.
Cambridge Dictionary defines a castle as a large, strong building built in the past by a ruler or important person to protect the people inside from attack. Just like Windsor Castle. Look at it! This beaut was built by William the Conqueror a decade after the Norman conquest in 1066 to guard against western approaches to the capital. And that's all she wrote. So, sure, sometimes we need to put a bit of thought into it, but as demonstrated, it isn't hard to define everyday terms.
Steve, Reese here again. That isn't all she wrote. You've made my other examples I gave you fit, which, good job. But consider Neuschwanstein Castle in Germany. This castle was not built to protect people from attack at all. In fact, rather than being built with military considerations in mind, it was inspired by romantic interpretations of the Middle Ages and the operas of Wagner.
Alright, fine. In most cases, there's always going to be some exceptions, but we can safely ignore them because they're so rare, right? I mean, why would we want to overturn our definitions for just a couple of outliners? Fuck.
Steve, what about this one, right? New Wardour Castle. Well, it's a manor house, but it was built near Old Wardour Castle, which was besieged and damaged in the English Civil War. And, in case you're interested, these castles don't fit your first definition either.
Okay, no, okay. I don't know about you guys watching, but I can really feel Western civilization falling apart around me right now. If I don't have clear, basic definitions, then do I even have a culture? Screw it, okay, look, let's broaden our definition. A castle is a strong stone or brick building. There, now every castle falls into my definition. Yes, fine, so too do schools, this office, your house, but as we say here in Old Blighty, every Englishman's home is his castle. So it turns out that we can include all castles if we're willing to simply broaden our definition. Moving on.
Steve! Fuck. Not all castles are built of stone
I'm not
or
in.
brick.
Well, shit. This broad definition doesn't include many Motte and Bailey castles, and that's definitely a problem. But you know what's made my obsession with an inclusive definition worse? I've broadened it to such a degree that I've stripped its utility almost completely, and still failed to be all-inclusive. So learning from this, we need a definition that maximizes utility. That is, a definition that accurately describes an entity so that you, me, and the rest of society have a common understanding. But part of that understanding entails exclusion. It has to. If a definition covers everything and anything, then it doesn't impart any information. It's useless. Okay, so what's the point I'm driving at here? Simply put, definitions aren't as perfect as we often assume. In fact, the only definitions that are truly all-encompassing are those rooted in a priori knowledge, such as mathematics and logic. On the other hand, a posteriori knowledge, such as concepts of castles, mammals, planets, and of course, women, are based on our current understanding of the world, and thus can change as we discover more information. This is why Pluto was once a planet, but has since been reclassified as a dwarf planet.
Pluto had it coming from the beginning.
In the Knights of Newton, we defined any celestial body that moved through the sky in a way that was different to the background stars as a planet. The word planet, in fact, comes from the ancient Greek term wanderer, reflecting the way these bodies seem to wander through the constellations of the zodiac. And no, the moon didn't count, because by Newton's time they knew, like us, that the moon is a big ball of cheese. And no, the sun also didn't count, since it's a giant cosmic campfire, forever roasting marshmallows. Entire civilizations rose and fell according to this definition of a planet. They had a clear understanding and no need to adapt since the utility was all-encompassing. But then, in 2005, we discovered Eris, which is aptly named after the Greco-Roman goddess of stride and disorder. Eris is about the same size as Pluto, and likewise is a wanderer. But astronomers knew that if we categorize Eris as a planet, then, due to us simultaneously discovering many similar celestial bodies, we all of a sudden have hundreds of planets in our solar system. This, among other considerations, led them to redefine what a planet is.
Pluto's orbit crosses that of another planet. That's no kind of behavior for a planet.
Or to give another example, mammals were traditionally understood, at the very least, to give birth to live young. But then we went to Zeus's Alpha server, Australia, and discovered the platypus, a mammal that lays eggs. Truly, the platypus is an astonishing creature. It doesn't have a stomach, it's got a duck bill, electroreception, only one functioning ovary, and it has unique chromosomes, 5 X's and 5 Y's. Oh, and how can we forget? The males have venomous spurs because of course they do, they're an Aussie. But it's still, according to Oxford Languages, a mammal. It's a warm-blooded vertebrate animal of a class that is distinguished by the possession of hair or fur, females that secrete milk for the nourishment of the young, and, typically, the birth of live young. Indeed, did you see what happened there? The word typically is allowing for the exceptions. The definition of a mammal, a fundamental category, was changed to accommodate monotremes, and yet civilization didn't crumble. At least, I don't think it has. Tying this all together, definitions are not quite as perfect as the average layperson thinks. They're sufficient enough for us to go about our lives knowing roughly what other people are talking about, but they very rarely actually encapsulate all instances of what they're referring to. And this fact is one of the first things you learn in philosophy. The issue of definitions being hard to attain, let alone perfect, has been known for millennia, as evidenced in the dialogue of Euthyphro, where Socrates roams Athens seeking to define piety. And yes, his attempts to find a singular definition mirrors ours when it comes to castles. There isn't one. Okay, so with this dive into castles, mammals, and planets on the table, let's apply this discourse to gender. The definition of a woman, like the definition of a castle, is an instance of a posteriori knowledge arrived at through experience. Hence, our definitions for both of these concepts are usually sufficient for everyday communication, but they don't encapsulate all instances of the concept they aim to define. And that's okay. The fact that we don't have an all-encompassing definition of a castle doesn't mean that we don't know what a castle is. That's right, we don't need a single exhaustive definition. You know what I mean when I speak about a castle, despite the fact that I can't give you a definition that captures all castles. Further still, we have countless scientific papers and books making reference to castles, with none of them providing a single definition that fits all castles. And yet, the walls of our society haven't come falling down. When it comes to empirical entities, definitions are often not all-encompassing, and that's perfectly acceptable. But if we are to recognize this, and we should, then we can't apply this recognition inconsistently. We can't insist that when it comes to some empirical concepts, we don't need an all-encompassing definition, such as castles, cars, art, mountains, rivers, leaflets, music, health, education, love, prayer, race, beauty, and so on. But when it comes to other empirical concepts, we do need an all-encompassing definition, such as woman. And it's this inconsistency of application that is, by my lights, the root issue with most debates on what constitutes a woman or a man. Those who insist on an all-encompassing definition are playing tennis without the net, since they do not hold the standard for all other empirical definitions. When the likes of Ben Shapiro, Piers Morgan and Matt Walsh pat themselves on the back because they've pointed out that the left woke people don't have some unifying definition on what is a woman, it's cringe enough. But when they confidently and mockingly insist that they have the correct definition, it's philosophical turbo cringe. It's like insisting that a castle is what J.K. Rowling says a castle is, because evidently J.K. Rowling is an expert on castles, just as she's apparently an expert on sociology. But this isn't only facepalm inducing because they insist that they have the right definition. No, what's more pressing is that their definition of, for instance, a woman being an adult human female, simply outsources the definition to two other terms, adult and female. And yet, both of these terms suffer from many of the same issues that the word woman and castle do. The cultural construct of adulthood varies significantly across cultures and has historically been different within just Western civilization. Similarly, the definition of female has evolved significantly over the last 100 years. We once defined it as genitalia, then moved towards chromosomes, and now lean towards gamete type. And FYI, these shifts have contributed to why the majority of philosophers and sociologists now separate sex from gender. That is, why they don't agree with defining a woman strictly on biological factors. But to wrap this episode up, when these debate me bros, who are usually beating up on teenagers, display their overwhelming self-satisfaction with their definition of woman that's parasitic on definitions of female and adult, it's not their lack of philosophical knowledge and introspection that pisses me off. No, that's fine. What pisses me off is their refusal to consider introspection.
I'm not going to use preferred pronouns. I'm going to use the pronouns that are accurate.
While the left certainly has its failures in reasoning and can be insufferably self-righteous, on this topic it's the right that's philosophically misguided. Their insistence on a rigid, all-encompassing definition of woman reveals not only a lack of understanding of the complexities of empirical concepts, but also a glaring inconsistency in their approach to defining concepts. Alright, now that we've nailed down the nature of definitions and the importance of having a consistent framework, we're all set to dive into the nitty-gritty in future episodes, starting with a breakdown of why the traditional definition of a woman being an adult human female isn't mainstream among philosophers and sociologists. So be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when this episode drops. Now, if there's one thing I really hope I've made clear in this episode, it's that when it comes to empirical entities, it's often the case that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all definition. That's just not how empirically based definitions roll, at least not most of the time. They're not about laying down the law, they're about describing things. And when it comes to definitions based on real-world stuff, those definitions are liable to change as and when our understanding expands. This is what happened with our definition of a mammal, and a planet, and, indeed, a woman. Yeah, that's a trans-inclusive definition from Cambridge Dictionary, no less. It's one of the few definitions of a woman that they acknowledge. And yes, they give multiple definitions of a castle, too. Talking of castles, if you want a deep dive into what is a castle, where Reese goes around triggering scholars, then be sure to check out his channel, as the video is coming soon. In the meanwhile, you can check out his catalogue. If you're a fan of history, there's a feast to be had. Lastly, the team and I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to our patrons and YouTube members for their unwavering support. And we'd like to gently encourage others, should they be willing and able, to also help fund our content. The creation of this series demands a significant amount of resources, and without your financial backing, it just isn't feasible. In any case, and as always, thank you kindly for the view, and we hope to catch you in the next one. Thanks.